When last we spoke, I introduced wicked problems and the idea that all of our issues that we're covering, all of our topics, are insanely complicated. Perhaps they're cross-cutting, or there's absolutely no way to solve it without everybody disagreeing completely. And I asked you guys to look for these obstacles, and identifying obstacles are a great place to start with your counter arguments, and also to examine when we are moving towards solutions. So when we watched the John Oliver sketch or show, he didn't attempt to solve like racial bias in medicine. There's no way to do that. It would be entirely too complex. However, he was looking at things like, giving training to doctors, having this certain form to fill out. So these really sort of small approaches that aren't going to solve it completely, but over time do draw people's attention to the necessity of implementing these kinds of structures around it. And that will maybe generate a little bit more awareness of it as an issue, and hopefully just create a norm that can sort of, I just wanted to use the phrase flatten the curve, and that has now integrated its way into everyday conversation. So I've been enjoying looking at our discussion board where you guys were coming up with different counter arguments and counterclaims for each other's topics. You did a beautiful job. Keep in mind that you do not have to cover all of those counter arguments. This is a pretty short podcast. So choose the ones that seem to be the most dominant and focus on those. Some of those counter arguments may come up when you start to build these alleviating sort of partial solutions. Maybe that there's some flaws to the kind of solutions you come up with, and then you can use that as a way to bring in counter argument, which some people asked how much space the solution should take. That's entirely up to you. If you're really into problem solving and you want to spend the majority of the podcast going over these different ideas you have for attacking this issue or creating more visibility or whatever, go for it. If you're feeling kind of iffy about that and you've been focusing on creating these good rhetorically like pathos-driven arguments that are very logical and you have good sources, then go with that. So this is a lot looser and allows you to explore what you think is just the most persuasive and most interesting about your topic. So those kinds of obstacles we talked about, complexity is one. People just not understanding. I think complexity of structures of you don't even know where to implement a program or pass a law or activate some sort of grassroots movement because there's just so many different parties involved and it's too complex. Cultural history is a big part of it. Cost, and that's both time, money, and power, and finally control. Just the level of control that we have to even do anything about it that commonly turns people into just armchair activists, where they will say like, oh, that's sad, we should do something, and then don't, which it's just so much easier to do nothing than it is to do something. But sometimes it's the organizations or the nonprofits or whoever or activists who are not providing an avenue of something concrete that people can do. So if we were in class, we'd be going through a couple different case studies of just really wicked problems that are damn near impossible to solve, and just getting used to the feeling of like, cool, I can't fix this. What's something small I can do? And so I just wanted to pull one out for us to talk about when we're thinking of those obstacles. So I'm very interested in menstruation awareness and menstruation activism, mainly for girls who live in areas where there are certain cultural taboos, which even if you put all of your other groceries and stuff on top of the tampon box and you still feel embarrassed to buy it, even though you are a 30-something-year-old woman, that's one thing. But it's another thing to literally not receive any instruction about it, which is so horrible for your health, period. But in some areas that are more disenfranchised than from urban centers, it becomes way more snowball effect dangerous. So in East Africa especially, so due to cultural taboos, girls are not educated about menstruation, and access to bathrooms at school is limited or absent. So this happens in many countries, so not just one in Africa, but specifically in the East, just because there is a lot of rural land and large spaces in between major cities. As a result, girls will miss school while on their periods, falling behind, and inevitably dropping out. This shows a demonstrative link to young pregnancy and HIV contraction, mainly because these girls are hanging out with people who are older than them. And so they sort of just grow up really quickly, and they're available. They're not really doing anything. And so, and if you think about it, that's a week out of every month. And so if you're just not going to school a week out of every month, obviously you're going to fall behind. So there's a bunch of obstacles here. I think that the idealistic solution is like, oh no, we need to go build bathrooms, but like that's insanely hard. First of all, who's going to who like pay for those bathrooms? Also, are we going to install like plumbing? Like that doesn't necessarily work in all these terrains. How do you get those materials? And even then, that doesn't do anything about the education. Like they can have bathrooms in school, and if they still don't know how to properly take care of themselves hygienically, then that's a problem. And a lot of these girls are just taking sort of bits of whatever they find around the house. A lot of it is sort of just like cotton fluff and using that, which is not always sanitary. So education's really at the root of this stuff. Bathrooms would be nice, but without even understanding what's going on with your body, that becomes even more dangerous. But it's not like we could just fly in there and say, hey, moms, you need to teach your kids about this. That's that sort of white savior thing that Americans are so good at. There does need to be more of a respect and a careful way to go about this. And then if we could look at the lack of materials. So you could maybe get a company like Playtex or Always or something like that to airlift a bunch of pads over there, but that's just going to add more waste into the environment. And also, that's a one-time thing, and we're still without the education. So we could keep going on and on and on and on about that. But there is no singular way to solve it. The bathroom thing is really tough. Some of the solutions that people have come up with, one of them, which is my favorite, there's a company, and I forget what they're called out here, but they create like this little like crate thing. You know how you could buy boxes or crates with different goodies or whatever. And so you can buy a crate and you get all these different period products per month. It's just like stereotypical stuff like chocolate, whatever. And then they also create this kit that's kind of like a build your own pad. And it's like a kit for sewing, and it has little snaps, and then it's sent into some of these villages, and it comes with instructions of how to do it, how to make this little pad, and how to wash it, and how to wash yourself and things like that. And it turned out to be really successful because the girls, because they were making these little kits themselves, there was a sense of ownership over it, and they were in like fun fabrics and stuff like that, so it wasn't this terrifying medical package that they received. And it was a communal thing that the girls could get together and do. That didn't help as much in areas that didn't have the access to the bathrooms, but this is where things like Diva Cup are and different menstrual cups are super helpful, because you can wear one of those for 12 hours. And so girls can go to school and come back. Of course, there does need to be that education about it, but it takes that kind of creative thinking to be able to sort of weave in and out of some of these obstacles. So we need to be using what is called a modular approach. And within sociology, this means linking different small wins to larger developmental objectives. You're not going to solve the thing, but you could find some sort of low-hanging fruit that could sort of change people's perception of and hopefully grow into something that's larger. So to use one more example, something we talk about a lot is where food ethics, and where our food is grown, where it comes from, and one ingredient or one source that we seem to always see in that context is coffee, specifically coffee in Central America. And Nicaragua, for a long period of time, was one of those very exploitative regions with their coffee producers. And if we just look at, let's say, late 90s, early 2000s in Nicaragua, it was a really rough time for coffee growers. So there was a drought, first of all, can't control that. There was a wave of cholera that came. Hurricane Mitch hit also, as even though there was also a drought, it didn't really help that. There was a boost in production of coffee crops in Vietnam and Cambodia, which meant that there was less demand in Nicaragua, especially because sometimes the prices would be more slashed. Foreign companies were like rolling in there because there was this government corruption and people didn't have jobs at all and were starving. Farms were folding because of that drought, because of the economic crisis that came from Hurricane Mitch. And so a lot of people were forced to work for these exploitative foreign companies coming in. They just didn't really have a choice. There's a heartbreaking story of one of the founders of Fair Trade, which I'm going to get into, was visiting in Nicaragua, and he just saw people sweeping. Like the government was giving them like a couple of pennies a day to just like sweep the dust because they were like, oh, we're creating jobs. It was horrible. And so you're really just stuck between a rock and a hard place because some of these things we obviously can't control, like the drought, like cholera, like Hurricane Mitch, like the boost in production, like that's capitalism, baby. But so Fairtrade couldn't fix all of that, but what they did do was create sustainability standards. So sustainability standards, are voluntary, usually third-party access, like Fairtrade, norms and standards relating to environmental, social, ethical, and food safety issues adopted by companies to demonstrate the performance of their organizations as products in specific areas. What that means is that they were able to guarantee minimum prices so that it wouldn't dip too far below, which means that there'd be more farms that were folding. Safe working conditions. They created direct trade between producers and sellers and didn't have this foreign company who was the middleman. They contributed community development funds, so it wasn't just taking from the community, but putting some of that profit back into the community, and did not use GMOs, only sustainable agriculture. And they did this by only marking up their beans $1 more. I think minimum, but most are between like $1 to $3 more. So for your consumers, like if you have an option between $8 coffee and $9 coffee, that's pretty cheap for coffee. $1 isn't going to be that much more. And so people may be fine with just paying that extra dollar. It's not like they made it $20 more. People wouldn't pay that. But just by doing this little thing, they were able to create a much more sustainable environment for Nicaragua. So looking back at my obstacles. So my obstacles were there's a fixed view of ADHD. People see it as sort of almost in a stereotype, which is also why we view like boys and children, very hyperactivity. We have a fixed view of medication. We view Adderall as a study drug. We have stigmas against being medicated, quote unquote, as a really terrible thing. People just don't understand it. There's social cost. People do get judged for speaking up about it because of those stereotypes. And there's that other nasty part of the gender roles of women are just expected and many times to be more on top of a lot of different things, instead of just succeeding in your career, etc. I can't address all of those. So I had to narrow it down. I'm like, okay, what are the different areas that I'm trying to change here? Culture in general, I don't think I could change how culture views things like ADHD. Elementary, middle schools, that seems to come up in my research because that's the primary time that people are diagnosed. Doctors, medical professionals, that's where a lot of the misdiagnosis is happening also. And then colleges, which is where women like myself are discovering that they have this disorder, usually on their own, and rarely is it with sort of the help and aid of the college or from the health department. So what do I want? I want acceptance of ADHD as a legitimate disorder. That would be great. I would love for better screening in elementary schools and equipping individual teachers, to better identify symptoms for both genders, not just relying off of the stereotypes. I would love if health centers and doctors were a little bit more aware during college years, and maybe, in the way that colleges, health centers will have pamphlets everywhere, sort of creating awareness around that. I'm not really sure how. So this sort of led me to PSAs that help women diagnose. Or self-diagnose. I know that I've had, when I've gone to my health centers in college, they have those little flyers that are like, are you depressed? And I wonder if even having those and having the representation of a woman on the front of one of those flyers for ADHD might help at least one person who goes in there looking for something, to link a woman with this kind of disorder. So that's sort of what I got to. This is probably I would probably look at the last three in my podcast, and I don't really know. I would need to research more about the second one, but I think that I could at least propose it. I don't have to go through the details of actually like talking about what does it look like to equip teachers. If this is a longer thing, we could. But I'm not going to make you guys do anything with this, no discussion board, but do think about what kinds of solutions may work well for you. I'm happy to spitball that with you if you are swamped in your brain and can't really seem to distinguish one from the other, and feel free to use your community as well.